controversy over whether, as part of the UAE's agreement to establish relations with Israel, it will be able to purchase F-35 stealth fighter jets, that's state-of-the-art, from the U.S., becoming the first Arab state to do so, and perhaps significantly eroding the U.S. guarantee of providing Israel with a qualitative edge of arms in the region. Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu denies that Israel gave a green light for any such deal, saying today, "There is no agreement with me or any other agreement in general of U.S. arms sales to the United Arab Emirates, not publicly, not secretly, not in writing. It is all fake news." Well, joining us now from Washington for more on this is Sigurd Neubauer, former non-resident fellow of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and the author of The Gulf Region in Israel, Old Struggles and New Alliances. Sigurd, I congratulate you on the timeliness of your book, for sure. Let me ask you, I was looking at your Twitter feed. You say that this this F-35 deal really seems to have been key in the UAE agreeing to establish relations with Israel, but it was a bilateral deal between it and the United States. What are you suggesting here? That perhaps the U.S. went ahead with this with either informing Israel or not making it clear this would be part of the deal?
I think it's pretty straightforward, and that is that for the United Arab Emirates to officially recognize Israel and establish formal diplomatic relations, the United Arab Emirates needed something significant, and the only political price that the United Arab Emirates was willing to accept for formalizing diplomatic relations with Israel was to obtain the F-35. We know that the United Arab Emirates has had a strategic partnership with Israel really going back to since 2008, and the relationship has moved out of the shadows. But for the United Arab Emirates to cross the threshold of establishing relations with Israel, it needed something significant, and the only price acceptable to the United Arab Emirates would be the F-35, and that is the real hard politics behind this agreement. And whether or not, if the Israelis at the end decide not to agree to that principle, the agreement will most likely collapse as a result.
Well, let me ask you, do you think Israel would be wrong to do that? This paradigm of Israel of having that qualitative edge, which certainly the F-35 gives it, do you feel that is still relevant, even from Israel's perspective, given that the UAE really is sitting on the literal front line of that conflict with Iran?
Yes and no. I would put it in this way: is Israel prepared to extend the F-35 umbrella to all of the Gulf states? Because what is clear to me and to most observers is that if the United Arab Emirates receives the F-35, Saudi Arabia will do it. And as we know, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are in conflict with Qatar. So will Qatar receive it? And if not, then it will destabilize the Gulf region further. This is a discussion that has so far not taken place in the open space, but this is something that Israeli policymakers need to understand, and that is that you cannot just provide the F-35 to one Gulf country that is in conflict with another and not expect the others to get it. And if that happens, then there is a strategic change. But right now, we know that Israel is really in the middle of this struggle between the two parties in the Gulf.
Right. Let me ask you, because I also saw on Twitter a comment from yours, very interesting, that Israel is in danger of misreading the Gulf. Can you just sort of expound on that and fit in what you just said, how that applies to that?
Absolutely, because what is really important to understand is that Gulf-Israel relations have not been transformed by the threat of Iran or by progress on the Palestinian front between Israel and the Palestinians, but rather Israel-Gulf relations have been transformed by United Arab Emirates striking up a conflict with Qatar and striking up another conflict with Oman. It is important to understand that Israel in the Gulf is a peacemaker, because inter-Arab fighting has dragged Israel into the middle of this of these feuds on the Arabian Peninsula. And what has happened is that because of Israel's stabilizing role, the Arab states are moving closer to Israel. but it is not because of issues linked to Iran or to the Palestinians. So therefore, it would be a mistake for the Israeli public to believe that there's a sea change in Arab-Israeli relations, when in fact it is concern over inter-Arab squabbling and how it plays out in Washington that is contributing to this new momentum.
No, Sigurd, it's fascinating to hear you say that, because really just minutes ago, we had an analyst from Dubai who was, in a sense, sort of criticizing Israel for allowing that Qatari money to flow into the Gaza Strip, sort of warning against Israel against Qatar. Now you're saying Israel is being drawn into those conflicts. So what advice specifically would you have for Prime Minister Netanyahu or the Israeli leadership about how they should sort of negotiate these conflicting interests in the Gulf?
I would say that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Mossad director, they know exactly what they're doing. They understand what is happening in the Gulf. And I would just caution on a personal level to suggest that Bahrain and Oman will follow the UAE and establish diplomatic relations. I think that is inaccurate. I think that if you look at, for instance, Saudi Arabia's decision today to say that relations with Israel is contingent upon the peace with the Palestinians, that effectively means that Bahrain, which is often seen as a satellite of Saudi Arabia, will not recognize Israel. And if you look at the readout yesterday from the phone call between Foreign Minister Ashkenazi and his Omani counterpart, where the emphasis was on support for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, that is also a message that Israel is not about to establish formal diplomatic relations with Oman either. So I think that these messages are understood in Jerusalem, and I think that the Israeli public will also now start to grapple over whether or not the price of a peace with UAE is worth giving up the F-35, and that's a debate that obviously will also play right into the prospect of the fourth round of Israeli elections.
Well, Sigurd, you're too modest to say it, but I think some people in Israel maybe should give a reading to your book, The Gulf Region in Israel. It might be helpful in the coming months. Sigurd Neubauer, thank you for joining us on